What do you think are some of the aspects of human nature that get in the way of compassion and kindness? What are some of the biggest blocks?
It's going to be a very deep question that we're probably going to go into a meaningful rabbit hole if we do, because the topic of human nature versus how that nature is expressed is a very deep one. What is human nature? If by that we mean genetics, who cares? Because genetic expression ends up changing it radically. Our genetics largely predispose neuroplasticity so we can be radically mimetic creatures. If by nature we mean that which is inexorably unchangeable, well, that whole concept is nonsense in a genetic engineering world. One of the things I love about CRISPR, even though I actually don't think we're nearly as close to being able to utilize CRISPR safely as we think we are, but one of the things I love about it as a thought experiment is as soon as we are now realistically thinking about being able to change the genome, our whole idea of nature has to change conceptually. It's a great thought experiment to say, well, even if we did evolve to have inexorable, competitive, or whatever traits, now, do we want to keep those or not? When you have that level of exponential tech where you can change the connectome, change the genome, the level of existentialism and ethics to say what is a desirable set of traits becomes forefront, right? You have to address it. And of course, science doesn't do desirable, right? It does what is, not what was historically. So how do we actually make a scientifically commensurate ethics and existentialism as part of the core of our work? But if I was to just fast forward over all of the subtleties of it and say, what do I think are the aspects of human nature that are inexorably problematic? I would say none. I think there's a lot of aspects of human nature that lead to problems when the right conditioning is there. But I think other sets of conditioning lead to fundamentally different expressions of that same nature. And so there is a propensity for human agency, for the impulse to self-actualize. If that is growing up in the context of zero-sum games and finite games from a game theoretic perspective, that can look like lack of empathy, pathological competition, selfishness. If you're growing up in the context and you're neuroplastically wiring in the contexts of positive sum games where winning doesn't require others losing, which then requires numbing to the pain of others losing, i.e. shutting off empathy. And in infinite games where you are not winning to win, but you're winning to keep playing, right? What does it mean to keep playing so you can't externalize harm? When you change the game theoretic constructs, I think the fundamental impulse to agency, self-expression and actualization, and the fundamental impulse to communion, connecting with others, can be simultaneously optimized without any fundamental dichotomy. So the problems are at a game theoretic level, which means an economic, worldview, mimetic, structural level, which then affect, of course, genetic expression, but are not fundamentally at a genetic expression level.
Sure, I definitely hear what you're saying, and as you know, I'm a big fan of Abraham Maslow's thinking, and you just used the term self-actualization, and when he talked about is man fundamentally good or bad, he says he thinks we're neutral, and it just depends on what are the sort of conditions that are getting what needs met and what needs not met. So I do like to think of it from a needs perspective. It looks like you kind of would agree with that sort of perspective of neutrality in a way, or what part of the human condition do we want to highlight?
I think that saying neutral is fair, meaning we can have an environment, say we go to some part of North Africa where female genital mutilation is ubiquitous, or we go to the Dark Ages where burning women as witches was ubiquitous. We can now look at that from outside or retrospective as a ubiquitous insanity, right? Of the whole population. They were infected with a psychopathologic set of means. When we look today at the fact that we externalize harm to the environment with almost every single action we do, and we still think that war is a reasonable solution to differences, and we step over homeless people while we go get more shit, future generations will see us as ubiquitously insane, psychopathologic, mimetically.
I'm sure of that, yeah.
And yet, of course, when anyone's in their ubiquitous psychopathology, it's just called normal. So we obviously have the possibility for a level of terrible shit, like scientifically optimized torture that no other animal had. We also have the capacity for levels of insight and rapture and charity and selflessness and other animals. I mean, we're these just radical potential capacities. But I wouldn't say we're neutral, because universe isn't neutral. The nature of evolution itself is that it selects for more orderly complexity that has new emergent properties, and it doesn't select for the opposite, right? Like there is a macro telos directionality to evolution that goes from non-life to life, from prokaryote to eukaryote, from plant to neurology, from reptilian, mammalian, etc. So life isn't neutral. Change is moving in an orderly complexity direction. And with humans right now, look, we're at this very interesting place where we can actually understand that because of our capacity for abstraction and choose to participate with it. And our technological capacity is big enough that if we don't, we'll self-destruct. And so we're at a very unique point right now at the beginning of the escape philosophy on exponential tech, where we have existential tech, right? Nuke was the beginning, but now it's becoming decentralized existential tech. So we will either have the negative traits that we have had for a long time self-destruct us, or we will emerge into fundamentally net positive traits because it's the only way to make it through.
So this is cool. So we do have existential tech, and you're in a lot of ways developing the opposite of that. What do you call that? What's the opposite of existential tech? Technology that enhances us in a way that makes us more pro-social and cooperative. What is that called?
You could call it omni-considerate tech. Omni-consideration is a term that you could apply at different scales. When we're thinking about working in human biology, medicine, well-being, omni-consideration would mean what are all the pathways that are affected by this chemical or this therapy other than the ones that we're intentionally affecting, which are usually what we call side effects, and how can we be considerate across the entire system, including what will the effects be in the future? Are we down-regulating an internal regulatory system, or are we up-regulating its capacity? So omni-considerate at the level of human physiology would be just factoring all the externalities progressively better. Omni-considerate at the level of the environment would be factoring all the externalities of what affects the whole supply chain, the environment, right? Omni-considerate at the top level is recognizing that we are not really separate parts that can think of our own advantage and disadvantage and win-lose games separately, but we interaffect each other powerfully enough, and we interaffect the biosphere powerfully enough that we are all really emergent properties of the biosphere, emergent properties of the whole. So we have to think about the balance sheet of the whole thing, right, of civilization and the whole. How do we support that? That's omni-consideration applied to tech and choice-making writ large.
We had Dan Siegel on this podcast where we had a very similar conversation about the interconnectedness of all life forms. But the thing is, I mean, it must be frustrating. You must be frustrated. I mean, you see something, you kind of see a truth that I think, you're quite right. I think a lot of people take this view as well. I think a lot of Buddhists take that view and kind of see that. But there's so much in the world of people that refuse to see that view. I mean, the American politics right now is, one example of this polarization seems to be hot right now, for lack of a better word. And so it must be really frustrating. And what do you think we can do to convince people on the level at which they will be receptive to it? How can we have them see that truth?
Let me approach that question a slightly different way. American politics isn't just dysfunctional, it's broken, right? It was breaking for some time. And in the last election, we got to see the Republican Party not put forward good qualified candidates, the Democratic Party take people's favorite candidate and not support them and support someone who is highly unfavored. We got to see the two-party system as a whole break down. It was the beauty of what happened was what only a few people were really acutely aware of. Almost everybody became acutely aware of, which is that it is a no longer adequate system for how we do governance. And so we see this kind of increasing chaos there, not just in the US, but with Brexit, with issues in Korea, with issues in Russia, around the world, we can see a movement towards nationalism because of problems with globalism, but also problems with nationalism. We didn't have 7 billion people ever, right? We only hit 1 billion people in 1815 for the first time after 2.5 million years of hominids. And we didn't have this level of technology per capita in the world, this much resource per capita. So we're in a fundamentally different scenario than we've ever been. And we need a different kind of decision-making, a different kind of economics. And it would take us a while to get into it. But in the next 15 years, 30% of all jobs will become obsolete from technological automation. That will be a complete failure of capitalism unless we do something like a basic income, because not only you won't be able to move people to other jobs because AI will be automating other jobs. So you've got guys like Elon who are famous capitalists saying go to basic income, which is not capitalism. And it's also not long-term sustainable. The critiques of it are also warranted. It's on the path to something that is not Marxist, socialist, capitalist, but fundamentally new stuff that's mediated by new technological capacities we didn't have in previous levels of economic theory. So I don't think it's just about motivating people to see something different, because the thing that we need to move to hasn't been seeable, right? It's emerging. It's about now actually developing what solutions for a ongoingly viable civilization in the presence of the technological power we have, what that actually looks like, and then building that so its demonstrated success creates an exodus from the failing system to a viable system.
I mean, there is in terms of the seeing aspect and seeing different perspectives, I mean something more fundamental, and that's just seeing the value of not being selfish. There is this innate human tendency to be selfish. And I mean, I hear you talking and I hear someone who's making abstract arguments that are not implication of you and only you. But people, I just see a lot everywhere. I see people who are making decisions solely based on them and only them. And that's obviously problematic for them in the long run and the rest of the planet. But it's hard to convince people of that because of these strong ego protection drives.
You notice that as a kid, they might think about them and only them. And then maybe as a parent, they think about them and their kids, right?
Yep.
As someone who steps deeply into a religious organization, they think about them and their people, whatever their religious group is. If they become nationalist in a deep way as a citizen, they think about them and their people as a citizenship or as a race. So this movement from egocentric to ethnocentric to, right, there's identity of who we are connected to that expands. And the direction of evolution is more inclusivity than to world-centric and cosmocentric. How do we recognize more that we're interconnected with and include that in our circle of care and choice making? I think the key thing to recognize right now is, and this is a hard one, but civilization, the main ways that we have done civilization so far are coming to an end, and fundamentally new systems will emerge if we are to continue making it. If you talk to people who are studying coral and ocean acidification, dead zones in the ocean temperature rise, etc., they'll say we have a very short number of years to make the oceans cooler than they currently are, because the coral are actually dying slowly at the current temperature. And we depend on them, existing phytoplankton that supports the atmosphere. The same is true across so many, 15 years to 30% of the jobs gone. That means a switch off of capitalism in a very short time frame, where climate change is not a Chinese issue or an Indian issue or a US issue. It is a human on Earth issue, and more than human, right? It's like a mammal on Earth issue. So is nuclear disarmament. So are the threats of exponential tech. We've never had a time in the history of the world where all of our issues were interconnected, global, and existential. You had like Gandhi dealing with an Indian issue. You had people leaving Britain to go find some new land to start America. There's no new land to go find somewhere else. You can't leave the problem, and you can't say somebody else can continue to be problematic. Like any country continuing in the wrong direction with species extinction or climate change strategies is enough to take us over the tipping point. So we're at this unique place where our global interconnectedness and power is such that we either all collectively identify that we're in this together on this tiny little bitty spaceship called Earth floating through this vast cosmos, and we upregulate how we do everything to have no externalities, to be omnipositive, or we all don't make it together. Basically, win-lose games are over because we are too big for the playing field. What it takes to beat the other guy actually destroys the whole playing field. So now we move into either win or lose-lose games. But it's one of those two, win-win or lose-lose.
Yeah, in order to have that perspective, though, you really have to take the long perspective beyond. You have to be able to imagine the planet and care about the planet beyond your very puny 80 years max, if you're lucky, or 100 years in max, perspective. You have to think about beyond that. And I don't think a lot of people really are thinking beyond that.
If you look at the fact that we're looking at geoengineering, which could have radical consequences to our atmosphere and the world for many generations because we are so desperate about temperature change in the next few years, the issue with coral is being addressed in the next 5 years. It's not 8 years. The issue with everyone losing their current jobs is the next 15 years. This is if people have children, before their children grow up, they won't be growing up into a world anything like the one they grew up in. So you actually don't need very long-range thinking. You just need to pull the ostrich head out of the sand, actually have a look and say, fuck, what does it actually take to close the gap between the trajectory we're on and the one we need to be in.